23 bodies lay hidden beneath the tobacco fields of Henrico County, Virginia, their graves unmarked and their disappearances orchestrated by two brothers who turned murder into a business. What started as a simple bet between siblings on a muggy September night in 1851 would uncover a killing operation that had thrived in secret for over a decade, claiming victims from 3 states and generating enough blood money to build one of the largest tobacco plantations in Virginia. Records sealed for nearly 70 years show that Margaret Carmichael was not the first wife to vanish from Riverside Manor, nor would she be the last to stumble onto the horrifying truth about her husband's family trade. Court papers from Richmond describe how the brothers perfected their system, luring wealthy travelers with charm and opportunity before sending them to their deaths. Their methods were so precise that for years no one had linked a single disappearance to the Carmichael estate, until Margaret's persistence finally brought their bloody empire to an end. The autumn of 1851 carried an unusual chill through central Virginia, a season that would forever tarnish the name of one of the region's most prominent tobacco families. Henrico County stretched across rolling hills dotted with plantations, their white columns rising against fields of gold leaf ready for harvest. The area had prospered during the tobacco boom of the 1840s, with powerful landowners building mansions along the James River and creating trade routes that connected Virginia's agricultural wealth to markets in Richmond, Petersburg, and beyond. Merchants, tobacco buyers, and agents carrying heavy purses of cash often traveled these roads alone, with little oversight and plenty of risk. Riverside Manor stood as one of the grandest estates, nearly 2,000 acres of fertile land along the James River, anchored by a 3-story house of brick and Virginia pine, with wide porches that caught the summer breeze. Carriages pulled up beneath century-old oaks, carrying visitors from across the state to a home boasting a 12-room interior, complete with a library, formal dining hall, and imported furnishings from Philadelphia and Baltimore. The location proved ideal for the brothers' deadly scheme, as the manor lay along the main route connecting Richmond to Petersburg, naturally drawing in weary travelers looking for a safe night's rest. The James River not only carried the Carmichaels' tobacco to market, but also served as a dark and silent place to hide what they never wanted their neighbors to see. Dense woods hemmed in Riverside Manor on 3 sides, giving the Carmichael brothers all the privacy they needed for dealings that demanded secrecy. Edmund and Clayton Carmichael inherited the plantation in 1839, along with 47 enslaved workers and a mountain of debt that threatened to erase everything their family had built over 3 generations. Their father, Josiah Carmichael, had been a respected statesman, serving 2 terms in the Virginia legislature and keeping close ties with some of the most powerful men in the Commonwealth. But when he died suddenly of apoplexy that spring, the estate he left behind looked impressive from the outside, yet was collapsing under poor tobacco prices and years of gambling losses. Edmund, older by 2 years, was the sharper of the 2, a tall man with piercing blue eyes and the kind of rigid posture that suggested military discipline, though his only service had been with the local militia. Educated at William and Mary, he had cultivated both financial knowledge and influential friendships, tools he would wield with precision. In his letters to bankers and merchants, he came across as polished and persuasive, though those who dealt with him privately often remarked on a cold detachment that bordered on unsettling. Clayton, by contrast, was the charmer. Slightly shorter but broader across the shoulders, he was handsome, witty, and carried the kind of smile that smoothed over suspicion. His skill on horseback and his popularity at fox hunts won him entry into the grand parlors of central Virginia, where he not only enjoyed the company of planters' daughters, but also gathered useful intelligence on the travel habits of wealthy visitors. Together, Edmund and Clayton transformed their failing plantation into a booming enterprise. Neighbors whispered about their unlikely success, but few questioned it openly. The truth was that in 1840 they began extending southern hospitality to travelers who carried heavy purses offering shelter at Riverside Manor. At first, it may have seemed like little more than good manners, but soon the brothers realized how simple it was to make such men disappear without a trace. With Richmond 30 miles east, commerce was close enough to profit from yet distant enough to shield their darker trade. Sheriff Thomas Garrett, more concerned with maintaining social order than solving mysteries, became a useful ally. His loyalty was secured through generous campaign contributions and invitations to the Carmichaels' glittering dinner parties, where polished silver fine wine and endless charm distracted from the fact that Riverside Manor was steadily becoming one of the most dangerous stops in Virginia. By 1851, Henrico County was a place simmering with the same tensions that would soon split the nation in two. Arguments over slavery's expansion pressure from the growing power of northern industry and constant talk of states' rights filled parlors and courthouse steps alike. For the Carmichael brothers, these distractions were a gift. While politicians and newspapers wrestled with matters of national destiny, the disappearances of a few travelers in central Virginia seemed like little more than the hazards of frontier roads, not the work of predators hiding in plain sight. That summer, Edmund Carmichael took a wife. Margaret Denore arrived at Riverside Manor in June of 1851, a young woman of striking beauty with auburn hair and green eyes that caught Edmund's attention the moment they met at a spring gathering hosted by the Virginia Agricultural Society. She was the daughter of a once prosperous Chesterfield County planter family whose fortune had declined, bringing little dowry, but a web of social ties that a man like Edmund could turn into influence. Her charm went beyond appearance. Margaret had been unusually well educated for her class and time, thanks to an aunt who had insisted on tutors and encouraged studies in French natural history and even finance. These skills made her a lively conversationalist and a capable hostess, qualities that initially seemed to fit perfectly into the life Edmund envisioned. Their wedding was a glittering event attended by planters, politicians, and merchants, with Governor John Floyd himself offering a toast to the Union. Margaret's early letters to her sister in Petersburg spoke of her new life as a kind of fairy tale. She marveled at the size of Riverside Manor, describing it as a palace compared to our poor farm in Chesterfield, and wrote of dinner parties filled with Virginia's most powerful men, fine wine, and food that seemed endless. She praised Clayton for his kindness and spoke admiringly of the brothers' apparent wealth, which far exceeded what most tobacco farmers could hope to earn. Yet by the end of summer, cracks began to show. Margaret seemed distracted during visits with friends, her gaze often fixed on the fields outside, as if seeing something others could not. Sarah Caldwell, a close companion, later told authorities her friend looked haunted, as though she carried knowledge too heavy to share. Margaret's appetite waned. Her social presence faded, and she excused herself from gatherings with claims of headaches that had no clear cause. Those enslaved at Riverside observed her wandering the grounds, for hours, sometimes vanishing, near the old tobacco barn, where old Moses, a longtime servant, swore he saw her digging more than once, glancing nervously over her shoulder. She asked questions about the plantation's past, about former mistresses and travelers who had stayed but never seemed to return. On the night of September 18th, the family sat down together beneath the glittering French chandelier in the grand dining room. But what appeared routine was in fact the quiet beginning of a reckoning that would shake Riverside Manor to its core. The dining room glittered with false elegance that September night. The table was laid with the finest china and polished silver, each piece carefully arranged to uphold the illusion of refinement, while candles flickered in tall holders and threw restless shadows across the stern faces of Carmichael ancestors captured in oil and canvas. Their painted eyes seemed to follow the living, as though silently condemning what the family line had become. Dinner began as it always did, with polite conversation carried across the courses. Clayton entertained with stories from Petersburg, rich with gossip and laughter, while Edmund, ever the strategist, outlined his vision for expanding the plantation's already vast operations. Margaret smiled and contributed as expected. But beneath her composure was a strain that only the closest observer could have caught, an unease too sharp to be explained by talk of crops and politics. The air shifted when Clayton flushed from bourbon and, emboldened by his own arrogance, leaned back in his chair and announced a wager. His words fell heavy in the quiet curling into the candle smoke. He bet he could seduce his brother's wife within 2 weeks, that she would not only yield, but beg to be taken from the monotony of Riverside. With a mocking toast, he raised his glass toward Margaret, his grin sharp, his tone cutting. For her, it was a humiliation and a threat. But the true shock came from Edmund. Instead of outrage, he regarded his brother coolly, the way he might size up a tobacco deal. The flickering light hardened the lines of his face, lending him a predatory look as he asked calmly what stakes his brother had in mind. Clayton, his confidence swelling, laid it out plainly. $500, enough to wipe clean a debt owed from a Richmond land deal, and 1,000 more on top of it. But he added a condition with a grin that chilled the room. If Margaret resisted too strongly, it would mean she had uncovered truths about the family business, truths that could not be left unchecked. His words hung in the silence, turning the opulence of the dining room into a stage for something far more sinister than polite society would ever suspect. The wager struck Margaret like a slap of icy water, cutting through her composure and laying bare a truth she had only begun to fear. This was no drunken jest between brothers. The casual reference to the family business, the knowing glance that passed between Edmund and Clayton, these hinted at a darker enterprise, one far more terrifying than simple infidelity. Her hand trembled as she lifted her glass, fighting to keep her voice steady, while her mind raced ahead, piecing together the implications. The man she had married, who had once wooed her with soft words and promises of a quiet life among Virginia's elite, revealed himself to be something altogether different. A cold strategist, a predator, who treated his wife's life and honor as pawns in a deadly game. When Edmund finally spoke, his calm words chilled her more than an outburst ever could. "Make it 1,000, he said, shaking his brother's hand as if they were sealing a business deal, not gambling over his wife's fidelity and survival. His terms were ruthless. If Clayton failed, the North Tobacco Fields would become Edmund's alone. And if Margaret posed problems, then permanent solutions would be arranged and the costs shared as they had done before. The ease with which they discussed her possible death told Margaret this was no new conversation. That night, lying rigid in the canopy bed beside her husband, she listened to the steady rhythm of his breath and realized she was married to a stranger, a man capable of wagering her very existence. Anger as sharp as her fear took root, burning hotter with every memory that now seemed sinister. In hindsight, the locked rooms dismissed as storage the enslaved workers who vanished without word, the guests who arrived in grandeur only to fade without farewells. Each unexplained absence, each strange silence between the brothers fell into place with horrifying clarity. Within days, Clayton launched his pursuit. He joined her morning walks, speaking of poetry and music, with an ease that suggested he had studied more than he let on, even quoting lines she had learned as a girl. He brought thoughtful gifts, a botanical book from Richmond flowers, arranged with unusual care, a ribbon that matched the green of her eyes. His compliments grew bolder, his charm more insistent, the performance of a man well practiced in breaking down resistance. But Margaret was not the sheltered bride they imagined. Her education, sharpened by fear and an urgent will to survive, gave her clarity the brothers underestimated. She watched closely, piecing together the rhythms of life at Riverside. She noticed how conversations halted when she entered a room, how certain doors remained locked under flimsy excuses, how workers vanished without the usual explanations of illness or family duty. Her walks across the sprawling grounds became quiet investigations, every path and building a potential hiding place for secrets darker than betrayal or debt. And with each passing day, her suspicion hardened into certainty. The Carmichael brothers were not merely keeping mistresses or hiding money. They were concealing something far more monstrous. The land itself seemed to conspire in silence, with its thick woods pressing in on three sides and outbuildings scattered across the grounds like mute witnesses to hidden crimes. For weeks, Margaret's suspicions had grown. But the first undeniable proof came on a storm-lashed afternoon in late September. Seeking out hidden spaces in the manor, she pressed against a loose brick in the library fireplace and uncovered a small cavity. Inside lay a leather-bound ledger and a grim assortment of personal belongings, a wedding ring with initials unknown, a gold watch inscribed with a merchant's name, a crucifix clearly belonging to a Catholic priest, and coins from far-flung places. Treasures stripped from people who had entered Riverside Manor, but never left. The ledger was worse. Written in Edmund's precise, meticulous hand, it began in 1840 and stretched across more than a decade. Each entry carried a name, a date, a location, a physical description, and a sum of money, as if each victim had been catalogued like livestock. Thomas Whitaker, September 12, 1842, Richmond Road, tall brown hair, gold watch $200. Samuel Chen, March 3, 1843, Petersburg Pike, short black hair, Chinese features, silk merchant, $150. Father Miguel Santos, July 19, 1844. Church Creek, medium height, Hispanic priest, traveling north, $300. The pattern was unmistakable. Page after page, the book tallied over 60 souls and thousands of dollars' wealth that no honest planter could ever have amassed from tobacco alone. At first, Margaret struggled to believe what she was seeing. Perhaps she thought these were records of debts or speculative ventures. But then she noticed the additional notes scrawled in Clayton's larger, careless hand. Disposed of according to plan, no complications, no further inquiries expected. And most chilling of all, Richmond authorities satisfied. Case closed. These were not business accounts. They were death sentences written with the confidence of men who had learned they could kill without consequence. At the back of the book, folded like a general's campaign plan, was a detailed map of Riverside Manor. It showed the house, the fields, the river, every road and structure drawn with military precision. But it was the scattered X's that froze Margaret's blood, 23 in total each, paired with initials and dates that matched the ledger's entries. She counted them once, then again, her hands shaking and her mind refusing to believe but her eyes forcing the truth upon her. Each mark was a grave. The ledger was no record of commerce. It was a murder book, a chronicle of human lives harvested for profit. The Carmichael brothers had turned hospitality into a weapon, their plantation into a slaughterhouse hidden beneath the veneer of Southern respectability. And now Margaret, by accident or fate, held the evidence of more than a decade of blood-soaked secrets in her trembling hands. Margaret's investigation quickly took on the precision of a trained detective, her every step driven by the knowledge that her survival depended on uncovering the full scope of the Carmichael brothers' crimes. Riverside Manor's location along the heavily traveled road between Richmond and Petersburg provided the perfect setting for their scheme. Travelers passing through, merchants, planters, clergymen, even hopeful immigrants were offered the warmth of Southern hospitality, only to be relieved of their money, their belongings, and ultimately their lives. The brothers chose their victims carefully, targeting those who journeyed alone and carried wealth but lacked local connections in men and women whose disappearances could be dismissed as the perils of travel in a state where law enforcement was scarce and slow. Armed with the damning evidence from the ledger, Margaret began retracing its map. Her walks took her to the edges of the property, to places where the earth seemed unsettled. Near the old tobacco barn, the ground bore signs of recent disturbance. The soil softer and darker, the plants growing unusually thick as though fed by something hidden beneath. Along the creek that marked the eastern boundary, she found fragments washed up by shifting currents. Bits of torn fabric, a brass button, the broken remains of a watch chain. Each relic whispered of lives cut short and buried in silence. Her most harrowing discovery came in the northern woods, where she stumbled upon a half-collapsed root cellar. It no longer stored food. The walls showed signs of recent work with added drainage that funneled toward the creek. Tools for digging lay scattered about, and chemicals known to hasten decomposition clung to the dirt floor. On warm days, a foul stench rose from within the unmistakable odor of death that left Margaret shaken, but certain of its purpose. The truth could no longer be denied. She was trapped in a house of killers, her life balanced on a knife's edge. The wager between Edmund and Clayton, once dismissed as a vile attempt at seduction, now revealed itself as a test, a way to determine if she had discovered their secret and whether she would need to be silenced. As October loomed, Clayton's advances grew more insistent, his charm giving way to a desperation that reeked of pressure from the bet he had struck. He cornered her in quiet rooms, his hands too bold, his words laced with menace. Margaret understood now that Clayton's pursuit was never about desire. It was about control, testing her, probing for cracks, trying to learn what she knew and whether she posed a threat. Every conversation became a tightrope walk of deception. She forced herself to smile, to laugh lightly, to feign innocence, even as she listened for slips in his speech. His remarks, casual on the surface, often revealed knowledge that only a killer could possess. She hid her terror behind composure, knowing one wrong expression, one betrayed thought could mark her for the same fate as those buried in the fields. The breaking point came on the night of September 30th, when Margaret pressed against the library door, heard Edmund and Clayton speak with the cold efficiency of men finalizing a business deal. They talked about a tobacco buyer from North Carolina named William Henley, who would arrive the following week carrying $3,000 in cash. Enough, Edmund said, to bankroll the expansion of the North Field, and they confirmed the schedule down to the inspection on the 8th and settlement on the 9th, while casually noting that Sheriff Garrett would be away visiting family in Richmond, so there would be no risk of an unexpected official visit. Margaret felt sick as their words made clear this was not commerce, but a plan for murder, with Clayton already laughing at the size of the take and Edmund outlining the timing and the usual methods after dinner on the 8th, including Clayton handling the nightcap. Then their voices turned to her, in the same matter-of-fact tone they used when discussing victims, noting that she had been asking questions about locked rooms, digging near the old burial sites, and otherwise poking around where she did not belong. And since the seduction tactic had not revealed what they feared, she knew they agreed to accelerate their timetable and arrange an accident after Henley was dealt with, debating whether a fall from a horse or a drowning in the river would look most natural and attract the least attention from her family in Chesterfield, the way they weighed credibility and timing, like merchants calculating profit and loss. As she listened, Margaret understood in full that the brothers had already decided her fate and were treating her life as expendable, because silence was essential to keep their operation running. Margaret pressed herself against the wall, fighting nausea and fury, as she realized the man she had married was a stranger who saw human life as a commodity, and with that clarity she made a decision: she would not run, and she would not beg for mercy. She would use what she knew to fight back. Fleeing was impossible. Edmund controlled the money, and the brothers' reach ran too deep for local authorities to help. So she turned the tools of their cruelty against them, learning to move and speak in ways that fed their assumptions about her weakness, while she prepared quietly and relentlessly. She began by studying the plants that grew around Riverside Manor with the calm curiosity of a botanist, revisiting the tutor's lessons and the books she had read as a girl, cataloging the native species that could cause serious harm and noting where they grew near the creek, the barn, and the shaded hollows. Water hemlock, deadly nightshade, and pokeweed were among the plants she observed and researched, each described in her texts as dangerous in the right doses. And her knowledge of their dangers gave her options she never would have imagined when she first arrived at the manor. She trained herself to listen, for the brothers' habits to watch Clayton's approach and Edmund's quiet calculations, and she practiced the performance of a frightened, compliant wife so convincingly that they would never suspect she was turning their confidence into a trap. If Riverside Manor was to be their last stage, Margaret resolved that it would be the place where their crimes were finally exposed, even if exposing them cost her everything. Margaret knew her only chance lay in gathering proof as meticulously as the brothers kept their murderous accounts. So she began writing her own record in a hidden journal tucked beneath a loose floorboard in her bedroom. Every page was filled with copied entries from the ledger maps of the burial grounds and her observations of the brothers' routines, temperaments, and methods. She noted Edmund's relentless precision and fixation on records, Clayton's rashness and arrogance, their reliance on bribed officials, and the exact procedures they used to lure, kill, and dispose of travelers. She even left instructions for investigators where to dig, who to question, and how to untangle the web of complicity that stretched from Riverside Manor to the county courthouse. If she didn't survive, her writings would. Meanwhile, Clayton grew impatient. His wager was slipping away, his pride was stung, and his attempts to corner Margaret became reckless. She adjusted quickly, changing her routines, ensuring she was never truly alone, and moving with the quiet calculation of someone who knew the next misstep could be her last. Still, she could feel the danger closing in. Edmund and Clayton had set October as their deadline, but Margaret sensed they were ready to move against her sooner. Then came Dr. William Henley. On October 7th, 1851, the wealthy buyer from North Carolina arrived in a fine carriage drawn by bay horses, the very image of success. Traveling alone and carrying thousands in cash, he was exactly the kind of prey the brothers favored. Margaret watched as the ritual began. Edmund and Clayton fawning over their guest, offering Kentucky bourbon, leading him to the best room, and speaking in warm tones about tobacco markets and Virginia politics. To Henley, it was Southern hospitality. To the brothers, it was the first act of a deadly performance. Yet Henley was no simple mark. Margaret found him cultured and thoughtful, a man well-traveled with a taste for literature, art, and natural history. In another life, she might have found real companionship in his presence, but she could see the trap tightening around him with every passing hour. At the dinner table, Edmund's questions about his travel schedule and family connections made it clear they were already calculating his disappearance, ensuring no one would come looking too soon. Margaret understood with icy certainty if she did not act quickly, Henley would be buried alongside the others, and she would soon follow. Margaret pressed her face to the window and listened as the house below unraveled, a slow horror that began with stomach cramps and tremors and climbed into choking gasps and the terrified shouts of men who realized too late that they had been poisoned. She heard Dr. Henley call, that he felt peculiar, and then Edmund's voice breaking as the toxin took hold, blurt that the bourbon was poisoned while glass shattered and chairs scraped across the floor in frantic confusion. The brothers swinging between anger and panic as their practiced calm dissolved into spasms and pleading. The sounds building into a violent chorus of convulsions, and then, after what felt like an endless stretch of minutes, an awful settling into silence that made her lungs ache with relief and a new, colder sorrow. She stayed at the window until the last breath was gone, the darkness outside responding only with the distant whisper of the James Rivet. And when at last she stepped away from the frame, she did so with hands that were steady but not untroubled. Knowing the deed was done and that what remained would be the hard work of turning their ledger and her hidden journal into proof that would outlive her. If necessary, the victory she had forced came wrapped in loss, and Margaret understood that the road ahead would demand more courage and cunning than she had yet used. Clayton's voice cut through the chaos with a clarity that chilled Margaret more than any cough or spasm. He had drunk less bourbon and could still move, and as he staggered through the house, his words turned to threats, calling her a poisoner and promising she would pay with her life. She froze when the name came, his accusation that she was a witch who had murdered them. And then the sound of his steps on the stairs told her plan had misfired for Clayton. Though weakened, still had enough strength and fury left to hunt her down. She grabbed the only weapon at hand, a fireplace poker, and waited as his voice grew nearer, hoarse with pain and rage, each crash and knock revealing his desperate progress. And when he burst into the bedroom with Edmund's hunting knife clutched in a trembling hand, he snarled that if he was dying he would take her with him, boasting of other secrets and naming victims. Margaret had only begun to mourn Sarah Caldwell among them, and the revelations landed like blows, confirming that the brothers' crimes reached farther than she had dared imagine. What followed was a brutal, breathless fight between a woman defending herself and a man empowered by fury and fear, a struggle where every move mattered, and where Margaret had to summon a fierce, precise courage to match the violence closing in on her. She parried, struck, and used the room's tight space and her knowledge of the house to keep the blade from finding her, driven not by hatred, but by the single clear goal of surviving long enough to make the ledger and her journal speak. Clayton lunged with the knife, but his body was already betraying him. The poison twisted his muscles into spasms, and his strike was wild. Margaret swung the fireplace poker with every ounce of strength she had, the iron connecting with his wrist in a sharp crack that sent the blade spinning across the floor. Clayton crumpled to his knees, clutching his arm, his breath shallow and ragged as the water hemlock dragged him toward the end. "You killed us all," he gasped, his voice breaking. "But you'll never escape. The sheriff knows everything. He'll hunt you down." His words collapsed into a rasp as convulsions overtook him, the poison seizing his body until he finally stilled on the bedroom floor. Margaret stood over him, her chest heaving, knowing this man who had planned her death and reveled in the deaths of so many others had finally met justice at his own doorstep. His warning about Sheriff Garrett only deepened her determination. If the local law was corrupted, then her task was not just survival, but exposure to drag Riverside Manor's secrets into the light where no bribes or social ties could bury them again. The house fell into dreadful quiet. Edmund's voice had been silenced minutes earlier, his end coming quickly while the faint sounds of Dr. Henley's last agony drifted from the library below. By the time silence fully claimed, Riverside Margaret was alone with 3 corpses and the heavy weight of what she had done. She spent the night not in rest, but in grim preparation. At dawn, she began shaping the story that investigators would believe. In the library, she arranged the bodies of Edmund and Henley as though a poisoned bourbon had sparked a fatal quarrel that ended in fraternal murder-suicide, a tragic but plausible tale when tied to money debts and family discord. Clayton's body in her room, the broken knife, and her own bruises would serve as evidence of his final desperate attack before the poison claimed him too. It was the kind of tableau officials expected: greed, betrayal, and ruin within a powerful family. But Margaret's most vital work lay in preserving the truth. She retrieved Edmund's ledger from its hiding place, gathered the journal she had written in secret, and prepared a bundle of evidence that documented every detail: the graves, the victims, the money, the complicity of Sheriff Garrett, and the methods that had kept the brothers' murder enterprise hidden for over a decade. She wrote her own account of the events that led to the Carmichael brothers' deaths, not just to clear her name, but to make certain their victims were remembered and their crimes could no longer be denied. By the time the first light gilded the tobacco fields, Margaret Carmichael was no longer the frightened bride who had arrived at Riverside. She was the lone survivor of its bloody legacy, the keeper of its secrets, and the architect of its reckoning. Margaret's carefully crafted account worked exactly as she had intended. When neighbors discovered the bodies 3 days later, drawn by her trembling claims of having hidden in the tobacco fields. After hearing violent arguments and cries from the house, the investigation unfolded along the lines she had scripted. Sheriff Thomas Garrett Long, their protector, was suddenly trapped by circumstance. With a respected North Carolina tobacco buyer among the dead, and whispers spreading fast through Henrico County, even he could not dismiss the case as a simple domestic quarrel. Forced into action, he began what appeared to be a proper inquiry, while Margaret, veiled in grief and shock, played her role with perfect precision. She cried at the right moments, offered vague but convincing recollections of quarrels from the library, and described her fear of being killed if she had not fled. To the outside world, she was a traumatized widow who had survived a night of madness. The untouched money in Dr. Henley's guest chamber lent credibility to her version of events. If robbery had not been the motive investigators reasoned, then it must have been a family quarrel gone horribly wrong. The story settled into the minds of those who wanted an explanation. Edmund, in a fit of insanity, had poisoned his guest, his brother, and himself in one final tragic act. But Margaret was not finished. Through an anonymous delivery, she supplied Sheriff Garrett with Edmund's ledger and her own painstaking notes, claiming to have discovered them while sorting through her late husband's belongings. The effect was explosive. The ledger's cold, methodical records forced even reluctant officials to acknowledge that dozens of missing travelers, once dismissed as bad luck or the dangers of the road, had in fact been victims of the Carmichael brothers. Investigators followed the map included in the back of the book, digging where the X's had been marked. One by one, the unmarked graves surrendered their secrets. 23 bodies in varying states of decay were unearthed, their identities pieced together by clothing, jewelry, and dental records. The scope was staggering. Men and women from Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, all vanished into the maw of Riverside Manor, their deaths hidden beneath the veneer of Southern respectability. The most chilling revelation came when one of the bodies was identified as Catherine Phillips, Carmichael Edmund's first wife, whom society had been told had succumbed to consumption in 1847. The truth was darker. Catherine's remains, still clad in a wedding dress, were found near the creek among the nameless graves of strangers. Her supposed burial in the family cemetery had been nothing but theater, complete with a forged death certificate signed by a sympathetic doctor. Margaret insisted on seeing the body, despite Garrett's half-hearted protests. The sight confirmed what she already knew. She was not the first wife to discover too much, only the first to turn the Carmichaels' methods back on them. With Catherine's body, the ledger, and the unearthed graves, the Carmichael brothers' empire of blood collapsed into infamy. What had once been whispered rumors and unexplained disappearances became one of the most shocking murder cases in American history. And at the center of it all, Margaret stood as both survivor and silent architect of their downfall. The investigation into Catherine's murder unraveled yet another layer of deception surrounding Riverside Manor. At its center was Dr. Elias Brennan, the well-respected physician whose name carried weight across Henrico County. It was Brennan who had signed Catherine's fraudulent death certificate, and it was Brennan who had quietly provided the Carmichael brothers with false documentation on multiple occasions. In exchange, he received payments that far exceeded the income of a country doctor, funding a lavish lifestyle that had long raised eyebrows among his peers. When confronted with the evidence, Brennan confessed, and his testimony revealed how deep the web of corruption truly ran. The Carmichael case became one of the most sensational in Virginia's history, not only for the scope of the murders, but for the exposure of the system that had allowed them to flourish. Investigators uncovered that several county officials had accepted bribes to dismiss suspicious disappearances, while others simply chose to look the other way, unwilling to challenge one of the most prominent families in the region. What had begun as whispers about missing travelers now stood revealed as a decade-long killing enterprise shielded by wealth, influence, and cowardice. With both brothers dead, Margaret inherited Riverside Manor and the fortune that came with it. But no one in Virginia could forget what the land represented. Buyers refused to touch it, and the plantation's reputation made farming impossible. In a final act of defiance against the legacy of her husband's family, Margaret sold the estate to the state of Virginia for a fraction of its worth. The money was used to establish a fund for victims' families and to finance better training for rural law enforcement, a direct rebuke to the negligence and corruption that had enabled the Carmichaels. Within a year, the manor house was torn down, its bricks carted away, its location left to the slow creep of wilderness. Locals claimed the fields would no longer bear crops, the soil spoiled by the remains of the murdered. Whether the land was truly poisoned or simply cursed in memory, no one dared to plant there again. Sheriff Thomas Garrett, once the brothers' ally, signed a final report that painted Margaret as a survivor of extraordinary courage, who had risked everything to bring the truth to light. He described her as a woman whose quick thinking had saved countless others from sharing the fate of the Carmichaels' victims. The report praised her anonymous cooperation in turning over the ledger and her generosity in creating the Victims' Fund. Notably, it made no mention of suspicion about her role in the brothers' deaths. Officially, Margaret was the grieving widow who had endured horror and emerged as the unlikely heroine of Henrico County. After the case closed, Margaret slipped away from public life. Rumors placed her in Baltimore, living quietly under another name, far removed from the tobacco fields and blood-soaked secrets of Riverside Manor. In silence and obscurity, she left behind a legacy that was equal parts survival, vengeance, and justice. One that ensured the Carmichael brothers would be remembered not as planters or gentlemen, but as two of the most prolific killers in American history. Some neighbors swore they received letters from Margaret in the years that followed, describing a quiet life devoted to charity and her beloved botanical studies. Though to Henrico County, she became a ghost, her ultimate fate uncertain. What remained certain was the legacy of Riverside Manor. The case became one of the darkest cautionary tales in Virginia's history, a grim reminder that the open road was never truly safe. It reshaped how travelers approached hospitality with strangers, growing wary of invitations to stay the night, and innkeepers and planters alike finding themselves scrutinized by wary authorities. For those who knew the full scope of the story, the lesson was sharper. Sometimes justice came only when someone was willing to defy the system. Margaret Carmichael had not only ended her husband's bloody enterprise, but had ripped away the mask of respectability that shielded corruption in the county for more than a decade. The land where the victims lay never recovered. Farmers tried again and again to plant tobacco or corn, but the crops withered as if the ground itself rejected new life. Whether the soil was poisoned by decomposition or cursed by memory, no one could say. The fields were left to grow wild, a haunted patch of Virginia where nothing good would take root. The trial that never came still changed Virginia law. New statutes required sheriffs in neighboring counties to cooperate when disappearances crossed borders, and state oversight committees were established to limit the kind of corruption that had once protected the Carmichaels. The reforms carried Margaret's fingerprints, even if her name was never mentioned. She had proved that even in a world where women had few rights and fewer protections, intelligence and determination could succeed where the law had failed. Her courage came at terrible personal cost, but it ensured that innocent lives would no longer be fed into the river of silence that had flowed through Riverside for so long. The final irony was that Edmund's meticulous habits, the very record-keeping meant to perfect his killing trade, became the key that destroyed everything. His ledger, written with the precision of a businessman balancing accounts, mapped out the graves and tied together the disappearances with undeniable clarity. It was his own obsession that condemned him, his ink on the page, ensuring the dead would not be forgotten. The Riverside Manor story is a testament to the darkness that can hide beneath wealth and respectability, but also to the possibility of justice when someone refuses to remain silent. Margaret Carmichael turned the tools of her enemies against them and ensured their crimes would be remembered not as triumphs of cunning, but as monuments to their downfall. So what do you think? Was Margaret right to take justice into her own hands when the system was rotten to its core, or should she have tried to find another way? Share your thoughts below. And if stories of justice served cold grip you the way they do us, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and pass this tale along to someone who loves history's darkest mysteries.